Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into the tatami-lined world of a samurai household, not the battlefield, but the ordinary morning that begins without clashing steel. You feel the faint chill of dawn on your skin, sliding through paper screen doors, as if the air itself is hesitant to disturb the peace. Somewhere in the distance, wooden clappers echo, a signal carried from temple grounds, a reminder that the sun is coming whether you're ready or not. Now, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're awake enough, post your location and the time you're listening in the comments. I love knowing where and when people are tuning in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The tatami mat beneath you still holds the warmth of your body. You shuffle awake, brush your hand over its straw texture, and hear the faint creak of the wooden beams above. No alarms, no buzzing phones, just the slow, almost ceremonial act of getting out of bed. The futon is folded neatly because of course it is. Even in half-sleep, you're expected to be orderly. Historians still argue whether the typical samurai household demanded such rigid tidiness every single day, or whether that's just how manuals and later stories like to portray it. Either way, when you sit up, you do it with a spine that could rival the beam of a temple roof. Your eyelids are heavy, but your schedule doesn't care. Samurai weren't kings of their households so much as prisoners of structure. Dawn wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. Farmers outside might already be rattling buckets or pulling ropes on wells, and you, with all your warrior prestige, have to pretend you're not jealous of their simplicity. The first light seeps through screens, glowing like soft lanterns, and you pull yourself into motion. The sounds are hushed, the sliding of a door, the whisper of feet on wooden floors. A crow calls from somewhere outside, its echo bouncing across quiet streets. You glance around, catching the still life of a room, lacquered box, folded kimono waiting on a stand, your daishu pair resting against the wall. The swords might be more decoration than necessity right now, but their presence is like the steady breathing of a silent guardian. You kneel briefly, bow your head, and mutter a few words, not necessarily prayers, though they sound like it. Sometimes it's a mantra, sometimes a whispered promise to keep your honor intact. Sometimes, if you're honest, it's just the samurai equivalent of, "Don't let today suck." The historical fact is that many samurai started their days with Buddhist or Shinto observances, even if they didn't think of themselves as especially devout. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some manuals even recommended early morning sword swings as a form of meditation, which feels less like spiritual growth and more like an alarm clock that can decapitate you. You stretch your shoulders, listening to joints pop, and stand in that room of order. The smell of straw, faint incense from last night, and the trace of cedarwood fills your nose. Outside, you hear a retainer cough, politely, never loudly enough to intrude, just enough to say, yes, it's time. Because in this house, time isn't kept by bells or smartphones, but by the subtle choreography of human presence. You pad toward the veranda, sliding the door open. The garden beyond looks muted in dawn's gray light, dew gathered on the gravel, tiny beads catching the day's first glow. You imagine yourself a grand warrior, but right now, you're mostly a groggy person staring at damp rocks and wishing coffee existed in 17th century Japan. The breeze carries the smell of pine and wet earth. You notice a servant at the far edge of the garden, sweeping in slow arcs. They don't meet your eye. That's not their role. But you watch them for a moment and think, discipline doesn't belong only to warriors. The whole society runs on it. It's like living inside a clock where every gear, no matter how small, has to click in perfect timing. There's no loud shout to start your day, no drill sergeant yelling. Instead, everything is polite, deliberate, precise. Which almost makes it worse because there's no excuse to rebel. You just move along with the tide as though waking itself is another kata to be mastered. Some historians say this morning hush was a way of controlling energy, a deliberate attempt to save the noise for the necessary parts of the day. Others wonder if later romantic accounts exaggerated the calm, painting samurai life as serene to make them seem like philosophers with swords. Whichever is true, the image sticks, you're awake, the day has begun, and the battlefield is nowhere in sight. You stand there on the veranda, rubbing sleep from your eyes, watching the horizon slowly turn gold. And though you know this day will be filled with duty, repetition, and more rice than you care to think about, right now there's a fleeting moment that feels almost sacred. And then, just to ruin it, your stomach growls. The first steps of the morning carry you toward ritual, and ritual in this household means water. You shuffle to the wash basin outside, its surface trembling slightly in the cool air, reflecting a pale dawn that hasn't yet committed to being bright. The wooden bucket nearby is filled from last night, and when you dip your hands in, the chill is enough to send a shiver down your spine. You splash your face and the shock wakes you faster than any rooster could. No toothpaste, no electric toothbrush, just mouth rinses, scrubbing with a willow twig if you're lucky. It's about as glamorous as licking a tree branch, but it does the job. The act is simple, but there's a rhythm to it. Water to the face, water to the hands, a muttered phrase that feels like both prayer and checklist. Historians still argue whether these ablutions were truly about cleanliness or more about ritual purity, the Shinto idea of sweeping away spiritual grime before the day could begin. Either way, you're rubbing cold water over half-asleep skin, wishing for hot tea that hasn't been brewed yet. You pause to notice how the house around you remains mostly silent. The retainer from earlier slips past, his steps careful, like he's afraid to break the spell of dawn. In a side room, someone adjusts a screen door, the faint wooden click echoing. Even the birds seem restrained, chirping like they're rehearsing for a louder performance later. This hush isn't emptiness. It's the calm before the machinery of daily duty starts clanking. A quirky little tidbit here. Some samurai manuals advise that warriors should avoid looking at a mirror first thing in the morning, lest they be distracted by vanity. Imagine waking up with dead hair that could terrify your enemies and being told, "Don't worry, it's dishonorable to care." You towel off with a rough cloth and try not to think too hard about what your reflection might look like. You kneel briefly before the family shrine, the kamedera tucked into its alcove. A pinch of rice is offered, maybe a sip of sake if the household is generous, though at this hour it's mostly symbolic. The shrine itself is small, lacquered, sometimes just a wooden shelf, but its presence looms larger than its size. You bow your head, the tatami scratching your knees, and you think less about lofty spirits and more about whether your neighbor across. The fence is muttering the same prayers with more enthusiasm. When you rise again, your body feels lighter, as if the water and the muttered words actually washed away something. Or maybe that's just what happens when you finally shake the fog from your brain. You glance down the corridor, its paper lanterns still faintly glowing from last night, their wicks sputtering as they die out. The smell of wax mixes with incense's strange perfume of lingering night and arriving day. The architecture itself shapes the silence. Sliding screens muffle everything. Tatami absorbs footsteps. And the whole house feels like it's conspiring to keep your voice low. You open your mouth to say something to the retainer, but think better of it. Words here are expensive, and everyone is a miser with their syllables. It makes you wonder, did samurai households always keep mornings this quiet, or is that an exaggeration from later romantic accounts? Some historians point out that children existed in these homes, and children are basically chaos in small kamino. Others argue that discipline was drilled so thoroughly that even toddlers knew better than to break the early calm. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle structured silence, occasionally shattered by a child deciding the sliding screen is a trampoline. The hush carries its own kind of power, though. You start to realize that silence here isn't just the absence of noise, it's a training ground. You're being taught to hold back, to wait, to endure without complaint. It's a small lesson in patience before the larger lessons of the day arrive. You wipe your face one last time, shaking your hands dry, and return to the main room. The light has brightened just enough to reveal the faint dust motes in the air, drifting lazily. Someone has already rolled up bedding from another corner, the fabric folded with military precision. You wonder if you're supposed to be that neat or if you can get away with pretending. Your stomach makes another complaint, grumbling like a bored drummer. But breakfast is still a step away, and for now, the quiet is the real meal. You feel both soothed and slightly unnerved by it, like standing in a theater before the curtain rises. And soon enough, it will rise on rice, on pickles, on a day that won't let you sit still for long. You sit cross-legged on the floor, the low morning light slanting across the tatami as breakfast is carried in. The trays arrive without fanfare, no sizzling pans, no scrambled eggs flipping dramatically in the air. Instead, there's a small lacquered bowl of steaming white rice, a plate of pickled radish that glows yellow like a shard of sunlight, maybe a miso soup whose steam fogs the rim. If you were hoping for pancakes, you probably won't survive this. The meal is simple, but in its simplicity lies a whole hierarchy. The eldest male sits first, closest to the head of the household's shrine alcove. Everyone else arranges themselves in descending order of rank and relation. You don't just plop down wherever you like. This isn't brunch at a hip cafe. Even where the tray lands is a reminder of your place in the family and in society. You pick up your chopsticks, polished wood, slightly worn at the tips, and tap them lightly together before eating. There's no casual chatter. Silence still lingers, as if conversation itself must wait for the rice to settle into your stomach. Historians still argue whether all samurai households enforce this level of restraint during meals, or whether only the wealthier clans could afford the performance of etiquette. The poorer warriors probably ate with fewer bows and more slurps. You scoop rice into your mouth. It's warm, soft, and plain, grounding you like edible meditation. The pickled radish snaps sharply between your teeth, waking you better than cold water did earlier. A bit of salted fish, dried overnight, sits to one side, savory, chewy, the kind of protein that reminds you why the sea mattered so much to this island nation. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some records suggest that samurai were discouraged from overeating in the morning. A heavy stomach was seen as a burden for sword practice later in the day. Moderation wasn't just virtue, it was practical, which means your fantasy of stacking 3 rice bowls and calling it fuel would have earned you a side-eye from the elder. At the head of the room, you glance around as others eat. Servants move lightly in the background, refilling bowls, adjusting trays. No one thanks them out loud. Gratitude is implied through discipline. Still, you can't help but think the real heroes are the people who got up before dawn to steam this rice over smoky fires while you were still dreaming about falconry. Your mind wanders as you chew. Maybe you're imagining the fields that produce this grain, stretching golden in late summer, or the laborers bent over muddy paddies, their backs as bowed as the stalks. You realize that your ability to eat in calm silence depends on the chaos of work elsewhere, carried out by people who will never sit cross-legged in this room. That awareness hangs quietly with the steam from your soup. You sip the last of your miso soup, its salty warmth lingering on your tongue. The lacquer bowl is almost empty, only a few green onion strands floating in the broth. You look down at your tray, a neat arrangement now reduced to crumbs and pickling juice. It feels oddly ceremonial, like a miniature battle that you're expected to win politely. And when the trays are lifted away, there's no stretch, no sigh of fullness. Just a straightening of spines, a quiet acknowledgement that duty calls and the day's real training waits. Breakfast has ended, and the silence that began with cold water has now transformed into the poised readiness of a stomach that knows better than to overindulge. You sit cross-legged on the floor, the low morning light slanting across the tatami as breakfast is carried in. The trays arrive without fanfare, no sizzling pans, no scrambled eggs flipping dramatically in the air. Instead, there's a small lacquered bowl of steaming white rice, a plate of pickled radish that glows yellow like a shard of sunlight, maybe a miso soup whose steam fogs the rim. If you were hoping for pancakes, you probably won't survive this. The meal is simple, but in its simplicity lies a whole hierarchy. The eldest male sits first, closest to the head of the household's shrine alcove. Everyone else arranges themselves in descending order of rank and relation. You don't just plop down wherever you like. This isn't brunch at a hip cafe. Even where the tray lands is a reminder of your place in the family and in society. You pick up your chopsticks, polished wood, slightly worn at the tips, and tap them lightly together before eating. There's no casual chatter. Silence still lingers, as if conversation itself must wait for the rice to settle into your stomach. Historians still argue whether all samurai households enforce this level of restraint during meals, or whether only the wealthier clans could afford the performance of etiquette. The poorer warriors probably ate with fewer bows and more slurps. You scoop rice into your mouth? It's warm, soft, and plain, grounding you like edible meditation. The pickled radish snaps sharply between your teeth, waking you better than cold water did earlier. A bit of salted fish, dried overnight, sits to one side savory, chewy, the kind of protein that reminds you why the sea mattered so much to this island nation. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some records suggest that samurai were discouraged from overeating in the morning. A heavy stomach was seen as a burden for sword practice later in the day. Moderation wasn't just virtue, it was practical, which means your fantasy of stacking 3 rice bowls and calling it fuel would have earned you a side-eye from the elder. At the head of the room, you glance around as others eat. Servants move lightly in the background, refilling bowls, adjusting trays. No one thanks them out loud. Gratitude is implied through discipline. Still, you can't help but think the real heroes are the people who got up before dawn to steam. This rice over smoky fires while you were still dreaming about falconry? Your mind wanders as you chew. Maybe you're imagining the fields that produced this grain, stretching golden in late summer, or the laborers bent over muddy paddies, their backs as bowed as the stalks. You realize that your ability to eat in calm silence depends on the chaos of work elsewhere, carried out by people who will never sit cross-legged in this room. That awareness hangs quietly with the steam from your soup. You set down your chopsticks between bites, careful not to stab them upright into the rice because that gesture belongs only at funerals. Little rules like that make you constantly aware of the thin line between daily life and ritual. Everything, even breakfast, doubles as a rehearsal for greater acts of discipline. Someone finally clears their throat, a small signal that conversation can begin. But the talk is muted. Comments on weather, on a horse's health, maybe a passing remark about repairs to the roof. No gossip, no laughter that would rattle the bowls. A samurai's breakfast isn't about indulgence, it's about starting the day with composure. You sip the last of your miso soup, its salty warmth lingering on your tongue. The lacquer bowl is almost empty, only a few green onion strands floating in the broth. You look down at your tray, a neat arrangement now reduced to crumbs and pickling juice. It feels oddly ceremonial, like a miniature battle that you're expected to win politely. And when the trays are lifted away, there's no stretch, no sigh of fullness, just a straightening of spines, a quiet acknowledgement that duty calls and the day's real training waits. Breakfast has ended, and the silence that began with cold water has now transformed into the poised readiness of a stomach that knows better than to overindulge. You step into the courtyard, rice still settling in your belly, and the world smells of damp earth and faint ash from last night's lanterns. This is where the day sharpens literally. The gravel crunches beneath your sandals as you walk toward the space reserved for sword practice. Wooden racks stand along one wall, lined with bakken, the wooden practice blades that bruise egos and shins alike. Beside them gleam the real blades' polished steel, wrapped hilts, each one reflecting a slice of pale morning sky. The air here feels different. The silence of breakfast shifts into a rhythm of movement, the swish of fabric, the soft grunt of exertion, the steady thok of bakken striking against one another. You bow before stepping onto the practice ground because even when you're half asleep and thinking about pickles, etiquette comes first. You pick up a bakken. Its weight surprises you if you're used to modern sports gear. It's not a toy. You slide 1 foot forward, test your stance, then raise the blade above your head. The kata begins. Downward cuts, precise angles, repetition until your shoulders burn. Historians still argue whether every samurai drilled kata daily, or whether that was more common in training schools than in private households. Either way, the image endures, a warrior rehearsing moves against an invisible enemy, like shadow boxing but with far sharper consequences. Your breath fogs in the cool air as you move. Each swing is deliberate, each pause measured. The body remembers what the mind is too groggy to track. You feel the grain of the wood against your palms, the vibration up your arms with each strike. It's not glamorous more sweat than glory, but it is grounding. a reminder that your identity is tied to this blade, even on days without battle. A quirky tidbit sneaks in here. Some samurai manuals warned against practicing sword strokes near open windows at dawn, because neighbors might assume you were summoning spirits. Imagine trying to stay disciplined while your aunt insists you're raising ghosts by swinging a stick too loudly. Your peers join in, their movements creating a syncopated rhythm. The courtyard hums with strikes and footsteps. Occasionally, two of you pair off, bakken clacking in controlled sparring. Sparks don't fly, but bruises do. One swing glances off your forearm, sending a dull ache up to your shoulder. You grunt, but you don't complain. Complaining is for people without rice in their stomach. The instructor, an older retainer with a beard that looks like it could cut steel itself, watches silently. He doesn't bark orders. He just clears his throat or tilts his chin, and you instantly know you're doing it wrong. His presence is heavier than a shout. You adjust your stance, tighten your grip, and swing again. The sun has risen higher now, slanting golden light across the courtyard. The warmth mixes with your growing sweat, and you're reminded that samurai weren't just thinkers or managers. They were bodies in motion, tuned by endless repetition. Still, historians debate how much of daily life really involved training with weapons. Some argue that by the Edo period, most samurai were bureaucrats more comfortable with ink than steel. Others insist that martial practice remained the backbone of their identity, even if war was rare. The truth probably lies in this courtyard. Discipline performed, whether or not an enemy ever shows up. By the time the session winds down, your arms ache, your back tightens, and your stomach regrets not sneaking a second bowl of rice. You bow again, returning the bakken to the rack. A bead of sweat trickles down your neck, catching in your collar. The air feels sharper now, your senses clearer, as though swinging wood at imaginary foes has knocked the sleep from your skull. You glance around at your peers, some stretching, others laughing quietly at the bruises blooming already. The atmosphere has loosened, the earlier silence replaced by camaraderie. Even in training, you sense that this is as much about community as it is about combat. The sword might be a symbol of status, but here it's also just a sweaty workout that makes you wish stretching mats existed. And as you leave the courtyard, the sound of clashing wood fades behind you, replaced once again by the rustle of the garden and the faint smell of hay drifting in from the stables, which is convenient because horses are about to become your next duty. The smell of hay reaches you before the sight does. You walk toward the stables, sandals brushing against the packed dirt path, until the air thickens with the scent of horses, leather, and manure, an earthy cocktail that clings to every stable in every century. The horses snort softly as you enter, their ears flicking, hooves shifting against wooden floors, polished by years of trampling. Morning light slants through the slats of the stable walls, catching in floating dust motes that dance like lazy spirits. You greet the horses, not with words. You're still not supposed to shatter the quiet discipline of the morning, but with a soft pat on the flank, a stroke down a long mane. The animal huffs warm breath into your palm, as though acknowledging your rank without caring one bit about your swords. Samurai might outrank peasants, but in here, you're just another person with a brush and a bucket. You fetch a curry comb, running it through the glossy coat of your horse. Each stroke pulls loose hair, flicks dust into the air, and gradually reveals the sheen beneath. Grooming isn't glamorous, it's closer to housework than heroics, but it's necessary. A warrior who neglects his horse risks more than embarrassment. He risks survival. Historians still argue whether samurai considered their horses true companions or more like expensive tools. Some chronicles praise loyal steeds like comrades, while others list them in inventories alongside armor and rice bales. Either way, brushing a mane is intimate work, and in this moment, you feel like you're connecting with something bigger than status. Here's a quirky tidbit. Horses in Japan weren't always large, gallant creatures like the ones painted in European tapestries. Many were smaller, sturdy island breeds, closer to ponies by modern standards. Imagine galloping into battle on something that looks like it escaped from a children's petting zoo. Still, they were hardy, resilient, and perfectly suited to Japan's rugged terrain. You lift a hoof, scraping it clean with a tool, careful not to let the horse shift and crush your toes. The smell of packed mud and manure rises, sharp enough to make your eyes water. But you keep at it, because this is part of discipline caring for the foundation of mobility. As you work, you notice others around you. Younger retainers handle buckets of water, splashing the stable floors, shooing away flies with lazy swats. A servant pours feed into a trough, the sound of grain rattling like rainfall. The horses chomp rhythmically, their jaws working with the same patience as monks at breakfast. Once the grooming is done, you adjust the tack. Leather straps creak as you fasten them, the smell of oil strong on your fingers. You test the saddle, cinching it snug, then step back to admire the horse's posture proud, restless, aware. It shifts weight from hoof to hoof, eager for the road it may not actually travel today. Because truthfully, you're not likely to ride into battle. This is peacetime, after all. Your rides will be more ceremonial, patrolling an estate, escorting a superior, or showing off skill at an archery contest. The horse, like the sword, is as much about image as function now. Historians debate just how often samurai actually mounted up in daily life versus how much the horse became a staged prop in the theater of rank. But whether practical or symbolic, the bond is nurtured here in the stables, in the quiet work of brushing and feeding. You run a final hand down the horse's neck, feeling its muscles shift under your touch. Its hide is warm, alive, steady. You think briefly about how much your identity as a samurai relies on things outside yourself, on blades forged by smiths, on rice grown by peasants, on horses bred by farmers in distant provinces. You're the center of a wheel that turns because countless unseen hands keep pushing it forward. Someone whistles softly, a signal that the stable chores are complete. You hang the brush back on its peg, wipe your hands on your robe, and step out into the sunlight. The smell of horses lingers in your nose, clinging stubbornly to your sleeves. You half wish for perfume, but know better. This scent is part of your role, a marker that you've done your duty. And as you squint against the growing brightness of the day, you sense that the rhythm is shifting again. Horses fed, coats gleaming, you turn toward the estate house, where another kind of labor awaits one that requires not muscle, but ledgers, not a curry comb, but an abacus. The battlefield of bureaucracy is calling, and you're about to march into it with as much honor as you can muster. You duck back inside the house, and the smell of ink hits you before anything else. The faint tang of soot and glue from ground ink sticks mingles with the drier scent of old paper and wooden beams. No horses here, no sweat dripping from catadrills, just the quiet battlefield of estate management. You ease down onto a low cushion at a desk, staring at stacks of ledgers, tax rolls, and rice tallies that make your sword hand itch. Welcome to the part of samurai life that rarely makes it into movies. Paperwork. You slide open a ledger, brush poised over the page, and suddenly you're less a warrior and more an accountant in robes. Your task? Keep track of rice collected from tenant farmers, monitor the estate's yields, and calculate how much must be shipped off to your lord. Rice isn't just food, it's currency, the backbone of wealth and power in this era. You're counting grains the way someone today might count coins. You drag the brush across the page, careful strokes forming kanji that feel more like chains than art. Historians still argue whether all samurai households really engaged in this level of direct estate oversight, or if wealthier clans pawned it off on stewards. Either way, the fact remains. If rice tallies are wrong, heads literal or figurative could roll. Here's a quirky tidbit to lighten the mood. Some samurai manuals warned warriors not to get too friendly with math, claiming it dulled the fighting spirit. Imagine your superior scolding you for being too good at spreadsheets. And yet, here you are, scribbling numbers with the same focus you once gave to sword drills. The work isn't glamorous, but it's relentless. You check reports from tenant villages, so many bales harvested, so many damaged by weather, so many withheld accidentally by peasants who claim rats ate more than their fair share. You try not to roll your eyes, but you know full well that rats aren't the only thieves in the countryside. Sometimes you must dispatch men to inspect barns, make sure the math aligns with the reality. Sometimes you just sigh and write the numbers down, knowing enforcement will come later. As you dip the brush again, ink pooling black against the stone, you hear soft voices in the corridor. Retainers are reporting disputes, two farmers arguing over irrigation rights, one claiming the other diverted water at night. You imagine trudging out there to mediate, and it sounds less like heroic duty and more like babysitting adults with shovels. Still, this is what samurai life often meant: keeping order, not swinging blades. You pause to stretch your back, shoulders stiff from hunching over the low desk. The Shoshi screen filters sunlight into pale rectangles on the floor. Somewhere, a child laughs in the courtyard, quickly hushed by a retainer. You envy the laugh, but you also know you'd be expected to frown if it reached your ears again. This house runs on discipline, not giggles. More papers, more numbers. You wonder, not for the first time, if you're secretly a clerk in armor. Historians debate just how much this bureaucratic role eroded the samurai's identity over time. Were they still warriors at heart, or had they transformed into a class of administrators with swords collecting dust? You look at the blade resting in the corner and wonder if it's judging you as much as you're judging yourself. By midday, your brush hand aches. The inkstone is nearly dry, the ledger filled with neat rows of rice figures. You lean back, closing your eyes briefly, letting the faint breeze from the garden cool your face. The smell of horses still lingers faintly on your sleeve, mixing oddly with ink and paper. Two sides of your identity colliding: rider of steeds, tally keeper of bales. You hear footsteps, someone delivering a tray of tea meant to sharpen your mind. You sip it gratefully, bitter liquid anchoring you in the haze of numbers. The warmth spreads through your chest, a reminder that while your sword waits for battle that may never come, your brain is in a duel every day with arithmetic. And as you close the final ledger, you can almost hear the unspoken laughter of generations to come. Samurai, those icons of sword and honor reduced to paperwork. But you straighten your back, tuck away the brush, and remind yourself, rice is life. Without this, no army marches, no estate thrives. You may not be slaying foes, but in your own way, you're still fighting. The ledgers are stacked neatly, the ink cleaned from the brush, and you rise from the desk with the stiffness of a much older man. Outside, the courtyard light has changed again, and another duty calls. Ink-stained fingers will now touch ink-stained scrolls of a different kind, ones filled not with numbers, but with poems and ancient Chinese wisdom. You slide into another room, smaller and more serene than the stable or the ledger hall. The smell here isn't horses or ink, it's pine and incense, faintly sweet, the kind of scent that clings to quiet rooms. A low desk waits with inkstone, brushes, and stacks of crisp paper. This is where your mind, not your muscles, is expected to flex. You kneel, tuck your legs under, and grind the ink stick in slow circles against the stone, water mixing into deep black. The rhythm is meditative, like stirring a pot of midnight. You dip the brush, steady your hand, and draw the first strokes. Calligraphy isn't just writing, it's performance. Every flick of the wrist reveals something about your discipline, your inner order. You're not just recording words. You're exposing your soul in ink. Historians still argue whether samurai treated calligraphy as genuine spiritual practice or simply as a cultivated skill to impress guests. But either way, you're here writing kanji so carefully that your shoulders ache more than they did during sword drills. The characters stretch across the page lines, balanced, curves alive. You copy verses from the Analects or perhaps a waka poem about autumn grass. The text isn't random. It's chosen for meaning, for lessons. A single phrase about restraint or loyalty can echo louder than any order barked on a battlefield. You pause, brush hovering, as if the ink itself carries weight heavier than steel. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some samurai practiced calligraphy so obsessively that their handwriting became famous. A few lords even collected brushwork like others collected swords. Imagine your doodles ending up in a museum centuries later, with scholars debating whether that ink blot was intentional or just the samurai sneezing mid-stroke. The room is quiet except for the faint scratching of brushes. A few peers work alongside you, each hunched over their paper. Occasionally one of you sighs, whether from inspiration or boredom, who can say? You glance at another's work, admire a bold stroke, then return to your own with renewed determination not to embarrass yourself. Once your page is filled, you set the brush aside and fan the paper gently, watching the ink dry. The black shines briefly before settling into matte permanence. Words become memory, preserved in strokes that might outlast you. The sword can cut a man, but these brush lines can cut across centuries. A retainer enters quietly, carrying another scroll, this one with a commentary on Chinese philosophy. You unroll it, tracing the brushwork of scholars long dead, and you feel the odd connection of warrior to thinker. Some historians suggest this emphasis on Confucian classics was a deliberate strategy by the shogunate, turning restless fighters into literate administrators. Others argue that samurai genuinely believed wisdom and strength should balance each other, like yin and yang. The truth likely lives in both views. You're a sword polished by ink, a warrior bound by words. You recite a passage aloud, your voice soft in the empty air. The words taste different spoken, like rice that becomes sweeter when chewed slowly. A peer nods in agreement, though whether they actually understand or just don't want to look ignorant is impossible to tell. After a while, your back stiffens, legs cramp from sitting so long, and your brush hand feels heavy. You set the tools aside, rubbing ink stains from your fingers. You look down at the page you've completed and wonder, does this reveal discipline, or just that you can sit still longer than most people? The light in the room shifts as clouds pass outside, shadows crawling across the paper. You think of the contrast, steel gleaming in the courtyard, horses stamping in stables, now this fragile brushstrokes drying in silence. Your life balances constantly between these worlds, blade and brush, muscle and mind. And just as your stomach growls again, because of course it does, you hear a polite cough in the hall. It's time to change rooms once more, this time not for ink or rice, but for tea. The bitter leaf, the careful ritual, and the politics hidden in every bow await you. You rise from the calligraphy room with ink still faintly staining your fingertips and step into a different atmosphere entirely. The space for tea feels almost theatrical, clean lines. Tatami underfoot, sliding doors opening onto a garden where moss glows green in the muted light. The smell of damp stone and bamboo blends with the faint, grassy aroma of powdered tea already being whisked somewhere nearby. This is no casual sip from a mug. The tea gathering is ritual, a choreography where every movement is deliberate and every pause has meaning. You bow as you enter, settling into a seiza position that makes your legs immediately regret being born. The host, a senior retainer perhaps, greets you with silence more powerful than words. His gestures are careful, each one rehearsed so many times that they've become muscle memory. A bowl is placed before you, ceramic, imperfect, its glaze cracked in a way that feels more deliberate than accidental. You admire it not because it's flawless, but because it isn't. That's the point. Wabi-sabi, the beauty of imperfection baked into clay. You turn the bowl in your hands, 2 slow rotations, because etiquette insists you shouldn't drink from the front. Already, your thighs are screaming, but you smile politely, as if enlightenment is worth pins and needles. The tea itself is thick, green, and bitter, coating your tongue like liquefied lawn clippings. You sip quietly, bow afterward, and murmur a soft oshi that might mean delicious or might mean please don't make me drink 3 more bowls. Historians still argue whether every samurai genuinely embraced the philosophy of the tea ceremony, or if many of them were just enduring it to stay in their lord's good graces. Imagine a hardened warrior pretending to savor bitter foam while secretly wishing for sake. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some tea masters held such influence that their favor could shift political alliances. Sen no Riki, the great tea master of the 16th century, was both revered and feared for the subtle power he wielded over lords through tea. One wrong whisk, one misplaced bow, and suddenly you're on the outside of the social circle. It makes you realize that sipping tea here isn't relaxation, it's politics disguised as calm. Around you, quiet conversation trickles like a hidden stream. Words about weather, about poetry, but beneath them, hints of gossip. Who visited which estate? Who sent an unusual gift? Which retainer looked too smug at last week's sparring match? You nod occasionally, laugh politely at a mild jest, and keep your ears sharper than your tongue. In this room, it isn't the swords that cut, it's the glances. The host prepares another round, bamboo whisk scratching softly against ceramic. You find yourself entranced by the rhythm, the repetition. It's almost like kata with water and leaf. A swirl, a froth, a pour. You watch, sip again, bow again, and wonder if anyone ever dared admit they dislike tea. Probably not. A confession like that could feel as dangerous as treason. The ceremony winds on. Time stretches, not in boredom, but in a strange suspension. You realize the ritual isn't about the taste at all. It's about patience, restraint, attention. The same values hammered into your sword drills, your calligraphy, your ledger work are being stirred into this bitter froth. Everything in your life points back to discipline, even this. By the time the bowls are collected and the final bows exchanged, your legs are half numb. You shift them discreetly, trying not to grimace as blood prickles back into your feet. Rising too quickly would be a humiliation, so you move slowly, gracefully, as though you haven't just been stabbed by invisible needles. The garden outside seems brighter as you step out, your senses sharpened by both tea and tension. Somewhere in the town beyond the estate walls, villagers are stirring, merchants opening shops, children running barefoot through streets. And it occurs to you that your next task takes you there away from ink and etiquette, out into the world where your armor still carries weight, even if the biggest danger you'll face is a drunk merchant weaving through the alleys. You adjust your hakama as you step through the main gate, sunlight slanting across tiled roofs and dust motes dancing in the morning air. The weight of your daishu, the paired long and short swords at your hip, reminds everyone who you are, even if you're not planning to use them. A patrol is less about combat and more about presence, a walking reminder that the samurai class keeps order even when no battle drums are beating. The road into town hums with life. Vendors unroll mats, setting out fresh vegetables, dried fish, bolts of fabric that shimmer faintly when caught by light. Wooden wheels creak, a dog barks somewhere, and children scatter like startled sparrows as you pass. They bow quickly, sometimes too quickly, eyes darting up at you with curiosity. You're both protector and symbol, part police officer, part moving billboard for discipline. A group of other retainers joins you, each carrying the same careful balance of authority and restraint. Talking loudly would look sloppy, smiling too much, undignified. You walk at a measured pace, scanning stalls, acknowledging bows with slight nods. The air smells of charcoal smoke, fried dumplings, and the tang of sake brewing behind closed doors. Every so often a villager approaches politely, hesitantly. A woman asks about a lost chicken. A shopkeeper complains that a drunkard disrupted trade last night. Nothing worthy of drawing steel, but all part of the samurai's role as a local authority. Historians still argue whether these patrols were genuinely effective at maintaining order, or if they were mostly ceremonial walks designed to remind commoners of their place. Either way, the effect is real. Backs straighten when you pass, voices lower, disputes cool before they spark. Here's a quirky tidbit: some towns had curfew bells rung at dusk, and it was the samurai patrol's job to enforce that no one wandered after dark without reason. Imagine explaining to a stern, sword-bearing officer that you were just sneaking out for late-night noodles. Chances are you'd be marched home by the scruff of your neck or fined a bowl of rice. You stop at a sake shop where laughter tumbles into the street. The door creaks open and a red-faced merchant stumbles out, swaying like bamboo in the wind. His robe is half-tied and his sandals don't match. He sees you and your patrol, freezes, then bows so deeply he nearly tips forward. You keep your expression neutral, though inside you're thinking, this man is one sneeze away from face-planting into the gutter. The others in your group glance at each other, deciding silently whether to escort him home or let him wobble into the arms of his wife's lecture. Not every encounter is so comic. A group of farmers kneel as you pass, presenting a petition about tax burdens. Their voices are low but urgent, describing crop failure, too much rain, too little yield. You take the scroll with both hands, promising it will be delivered to the steward. Whether anything changes is beyond your control, but the ritual of being heard matters. It's as much performance as justice. You notice how shopkeepers tuck themselves straighter when they see your swords, how even stray dogs skitter away from your footsteps. The authority isn't always about action, it's about atmosphere. You don't need to shout, because the swords whisper for you. And yet, ironically, samurai patrols could be the most boring duty of all. You've trained to strike fast, to ride hard, to face the chaos of battle, but here you are, scanning alleys for pickpockets and counting how many times villagers bow. Still, boredom is its own kind of test. Can you walk slowly, maintain dignity, and keep your patience when nothing dramatic happens? It's like the tea ceremony again, stretched out across muddy roads instead of tatami. At one corner, a rice seller greets you with a nervous smile, pressing a small sample into your hand. You taste it, nod approvingly, and he beams like he's just won a duel. Another shopkeeper insists you try his new pickled radish recipe. You crunch politely, wondering if your stomach will forgive you later. Diplomacy, after all, comes in many flavors, sometimes sour, sometimes salty. The patrol takes you through narrow lanes where laundry flaps overhead, past shrines where incense curls lazily into the air, and into open squares where farmers trade news with townsfolk. You hear stories of fox spirits, rumors of bandits in the hills, complaints about rising prices. None of it requires steel today, but all of it builds a picture of the life you're sworn to protect. By the time you circle back toward the estate, the sun is higher, and your legs feel the steady ache of ritual walking. You've dispensed a few warnings, mediated a minor quarrel between fishmongers, and prevented one tipsy merchant from falling into a horse trough. Hardly heroic, but quietly important. The townspeople relax once you're gone, chatter rising again like cicadas after a pause. You pass through the gate once more, armor creaking slightly, dayshoe still sheathed. No blood spilled, no glory, just another day, proving that order isn't always enforced by violence. Sometimes it's enforced by simply being there, walking steadily, eyes sharp, presence undeniable. And yet, as you cross the threshold back into the quiet of the estate, you can't help but wonder if the falcon waiting in the aviary will bring more excitement than this patrol did. The estate's courtyard feels different when you're not marching through it on patrol. The hum of the town has faded, replaced by the rustle of trees and the faint hiss of wind against tiled roofs. You slip past the main hall and toward the falconry grounds, where sharp eyes and sharper beaks are waiting. Falconry isn't just a pastime, it's a statement. You don't need to hunt for food. The estate already has rice, fish, vegetables, all carefully managed. No, this is about discipline, patience, and showing off that you can command one of nature's most stubborn predators. Training a hawk or falcon requires the same balance of firmness and subtlety you'd use with a blade. Too harsh and the bird rebels. Too soft and it ignores you. The falconer greets you with a bow, leather glove already outstretched. On his arm perches a hawk, feathers gleaming like lacquered wood. Its eyes swivel toward you, unblinking, as if to say, "You think you're in charge here? We'll see about that." You chuckle inwardly 3 hours on patrol making villagers bow, and suddenly you're back to negotiating with a bird that has zero respect for your rank. You slip on the heavy glove, and the hawk steps onto your arm, talons gripping with a pressure that's not quite painful, but definitely a reminder of power. The world narrows to the rustle of feathers and the faint, metallic jingle of the bird's tiny bells. The falconer nods, stepping back, letting you handle the creature yourself. Historians still argue whether falconry in Japan was purely a warrior's pastime or also a political signal. When a lord sent a hawk as a gift, it wasn't just a bird, it was a declaration of alliance, wealth, and subtle intimidation. After all, if you can train a predator to obey, what does that say about your ability to command men? Here's a quirky tidbit. Some samurai name their falcons after fearsome warriors of legend, like Benkei or Yoshitsune, as if hoping a little of that spirit would rub off. Imagine yelling, "Go, Benkei," into the sky while your bird bolts after a rabbit. Kind of like today's soccer fans naming their cars after famous strikers. You walk toward the open field beyond the estate walls, falcon perched and tense with potential energy. A servant releases a rabbit, and the world seems to hold its breath. You extend your arm, muscles braced, then push upward. The hawk bursts into the air, wings slicing with a rush of sound. It soars, circles, then dives so fast you almost lose sight. The impact is quick, brutal, final. The hawk pins its prey, talons tight. You approach, breathing evenly, not rushing. Part of the training is teaching the bird that it doesn't feast without your say-so. You reward it with scraps, retrieving the rabbit yourself. The hawk ruffles its feathers indignantly, like a teenager told to wait before opening a present. Falconry is as much about your own discipline as the birds, waiting for the right moment, keeping still when every muscle wants to twitch, trusting that the hawk's instincts will sync with your guidance's meditation with claws and feathers. You realize your hand is steadier now than it was during morning sword drills. Funny how patience with a bird can sharpen your nerves better than endless cuts at a wooden post. Sometimes the hunt takes you farther afield, into forests where sunlight flickers through bamboo and streams murmur quietly. You ride slowly, bird hooded on your arm, scanning for hares or pheasants. The silence is broken only by cicadas, your horse's steady hooves, and the occasional hiss of the hawk shifting. You almost forget that you're supposed to be demonstrating martial discipline. It feels more like a strange kind of companionship. And then there are days when the hawk refuses to return. You call, whistle, raise your arm until your shoulder burns nothing. The bird has its own mind, after all, and sometimes it decides freedom tastes better than obedience. The falconer shrugs, muttering that it'll come back when hungry. You sigh, realizing you've just spent 2 hours arguing with a bird that doesn't care you're carrying 2 swords. Still, when it works, there's a quiet thrill in feeling that connection. Predator and warrior, tied by trust, both existing on the knife edge between control and chaos. The samurai who weren't at war needed ways to keep their skills and their tempers honed. Falconry, for all its quirks, provided exactly that. As the sun begins to dip, painting the sky in soft gold and plum, you return to the estate, hawk once again hooded and calm on your arm. Servants bow as you pass, though you suspect they're just relieved the bird isn't trying to eat their chickens. You hand the hawk back to the falconer, feeling the ghost of its weight linger on your wrist. There's something grounding in the ritual. You walked among people earlier, enforcing order with silent authority. Now you've walked with a predator, practicing control that no one else witnessed. Both, in their own ways, remind you that a samurai's life isn't about constant war. It's about learning to hold power lightly, whether over villagers or over a bird that could just as easily claw your face off. By the time you hand back the hawk, your stomach is already making little grumbles of protest. Good news! Dinner is next. And dinner, when you're not bleeding on a battlefield, is both comfort and performance. The main hall is already lit, lamps casting soft amber across polished wood. Tatami mats stretch neatly, and low trays are set in precise alignment. A few retainers shuffle in ahead of you, bowing before taking their places. There's no grand feast. It's not New Year or your lord's birthday, but still, every meal feels like a quiet rehearsal of order. Rice steams in wooden bowls, and the smell of grilled river fish drifts lazily upward. Miso soup, thick with earthy aroma, waits beside pickled vegetables arranged almost like tiny works of art. You lower yourself onto the mat, knees folding, body sinking into the familiar ache of seiza. Your toes are already asleep, but you don't dare wiggle them. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Samurai meals were not giant platters of meat, like some Hollywood banquet scenes suggest. In fact, meat from 4-legged animals was taboo for much of Japanese history. Instead, samurai dined mostly on rice, miso, fish, and seasonal vegetables. A balanced diet, sure, but also one that wouldn't exactly thrill a steakhouse crowd. You'd pick up your lacquered bowl, lift it slightly, and sip. The soup is warm, almost sweet, with that fermented kick that makes miso taste both ancient and alive. Someone across the hall coughs discreetly, another clears their throat. Nobody speaks loudly. Dinner is more ceremony than chatter. Now here's the quirky tidbit samurai were told to chew each bite of rice at least 30 times before swallowing. 30, as if the rice needed a complete dental exam before reaching your stomach. The idea was that proper chewing aided digestion, improved mindfulness, and honestly, probably helped stretch out rations during leaner seasons. But still, 30 chews per mouthful means a simple bowl of rice takes forever. You glance down and realize you're still on bite number 3 while your stomach is already bargaining with your brain. Historians still argue whether samurai dining etiquette was genuinely about health and Zen discipline or simply about control, teaching warriors to endure patience even in the face of hunger. Either way, you sit there, politely counting chews, wondering if anyone would notice if you slipped down to 25. At the head of the hall, a higher-ranking retainer demonstrates near-perfect form. Bowls held at just the right height, no slurping, no idle chatter. You copy the movements, trying not to spill miso on your hakoma. The silence is broken only by the clink of chopsticks and the faint pop of firewood. Your next tray arrives, a small dish of sashimi, thin slices of fish glistening like jewels. The first bite is delicate, cool, a sudden flash of the ocean in your mouth. You take a moment to savor it, though your brain is still giggling at the idea of 30 chews per slice. If you tried that here, you'd be chewing raw fish paste. And then comes sake. The lacquer cups are small, the pores smaller, but the warmth that spreads is immediate. Sake isn't for getting drunk at least not during a formal meal like this. It's for smoothing conversation, lowering the sharp edges of rank, allowing a little humanity to slip through. One retainer leans slightly toward another, whispering about the falcons that nearly stole a servant's hat earlier. You bite back a laugh into your rice. Samurai may live under a code of dignity, but even warriors enjoy a little gossip with their soup. Your thoughts drift to the sheer logistics of it all. The cooks who wake before dawn to prepare these dishes, the servants who line the trays with near-military precision, the rules drilled into everyone so that eating becomes as disciplined as sword practice. Even dinner reminds you that the samurai life is a theater of order. And yet there's comfort here. The flavors are simple, the rhythms predictable, the silence oddly calming. You're not charging into battle, but the rice, the fish, the soup, they refuel the same body that would wield a blade tomorrow if ordered. The line between luxury and necessity blurs when you realize that both rice and armor are just different kinds of fuel. By the time dessert arrives, sweet red beans in a small bowl, you're full, though in that restrained samurai way where you pretend you could still eat more if duty required. You bow slightly to the tray, a gesture of thanks not just to the food, but to the hands that prepared it. The hall empties slowly, everyone bowing as they leave. You rise carefully, legs prickling as blood rushes back to your feet. For a brief moment, you wonder if battle might actually be easier than sitting perfectly still through another hour of 30-chew discipline. At least swinging a sword doesn't leave your knees numb. The night air outside is cool, carrying the faint scent of pine. Your belly is content, your mind steadied by ritual. Dinner isn't just fuel, it's another piece of armor, invisible but essential, reminding you that even off the battlefield, every action is part of the code. The stars are out by the time you step back into the courtyard. A crescent moon hangs low, pale as a polished blade. You breathe in the evening air, heavy with the scent of pine resin and faint wood smoke. Dinner has left you warm, drowsy, but not yet free, because now comes one of the most important rituals of a samurai evening, storytelling and poetry. You shuffle toward the gathering hall, where lanterns glow softly against sliding paper doors. Inside, warriors are seated in a loose circle, some cross-legged, others with knees folded neatly under them. A brazier glows in the center, casting just enough warmth to invite conversation. The flickering light paints the walls with shadows that make everyone look more mysterious than they probably feel. This is not about grand speeches or drunken boasting. The Tokugawa peace has robbed many samurai of battlefield stories, so evenings like this become a stage for memory, for wit, and occasionally for flat-out embellishment. You take your place among the others, and soon the first tale begins, an older retainer describing, for the 100th time, the day he nearly slew 2 bandits with a single arrow. Nearly, mind you. Funny how nearly always grows bolder with each retelling. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Samurai culture prized oral storytelling, not just as entertainment, but as moral instruction. Tales of loyalty, sacrifice, or clever strategy weren't just idle chatter, they were teaching tools, passed from one generation of warriors to the next. A younger samurai clears his throat and recites a poem instead. His voice is soft, but the cadence catches. 17 syllables strung like beads. A haiku about autumn leaves drifting across the moat. Everyone nods in appreciation, though one man next to you mutters that his grandmother could have written better. You bite down a laugh into your sleeve. Now for the quirky tidbit, samurai sometimes use poetry battles, yes, actual competitions to settle disputes of honor without drawing swords. Imagine challenging someone not to a duel at dawn but to a verse-off under candlelight. You insulted my clan? Fine, let's see who can write the most devastating seasonal metaphor. Not quite as cinematic as a sword fight, but probably a lot safer for the tatami. Historians still argue whether these poetry contests were sincere art or just elaborate excuses to avoid bloodshed in a tightly controlled society. Maybe both. You suspect some warriors poured genuine heart into their verses, while others just faked enthusiasm until the sake arrived. The circle continues, stories weaving between laughter and solemn silence. One retainer speaks of his grandfather's blade, forged by a master smith, a sword said to hum when drawn in moonlight. Another recites a Buddhist parable about impermanence, his words hanging heavy, reminding everyone that even the strongest armor rusts eventually. You notice the rhythm of the night, tale, pause, sip of tea or sake, then another tale. It's like a heartbeat steady, almost hypnotic. The room feels less like a group of armed retainers and more like children around a campfire, clinging to words as both entertainment and glue. Someone nudges you. Apparently, it's your turn. Your throat goes dry as every pair of eyes turns your way. You could attempt a haiku, but your last effort rhymed sword with gourd, and that disaster doesn't need repeating. So instead you lean into humor. You clear your throat and launch into the story of the falcon that tried to steal a servant's hat earlier. You mimic the servant's panicked flailing, the bird's smug swoop, the retainer's frantic chase. By the end, the hall is shaking with suppressed laughter, shoulders quivering as men try to maintain dignity. One man actually wheezes into his sleeve, and even the stern older retainer smirks into his sake. There's relief in the laughter, like steam venting from a pot. For all the solemn codes and daily drills, these men are still human. A shared joke becomes as binding as a shared oath. The circle eventually slows, voices trailing off, cups empty. Someone strums a biwa, plucking slow notes that echo like droplets into a well. The music settles into your chest, deep and soothing, like the steady hum of a distant fan. You close your eyes briefly, imagining autumn leaves drifting across the moat, carried off by water that doesn't ask for permission. The gathering breaks quietly. No loud goodbyes, just a series of bows and shuffling sandals as everyone drifts back into the night. You step outside, the cool air washing over you again, the sky above now thick with stars. The poetry lingers in your mind, the laughter still warming your ribs. Storytelling and poetry, not just entertainment, but another kind of weapon. Not one that cuts flesh, but one that shapes memory, reinforces bonds, and keeps a class of warriors from rusting too quickly in the stillness of peace. The courtyard feels quieter now, emptied of chatter and footsteps, as you make your way toward the small shrine tucked near the estate wall. Lanterns have been extinguished, save for one faint glow inside the wooden alcove. The night is cooler, and a cicada chorus drones faintly in the trees. Your feet crunch softly on gravel as you bow before the modest Shinto altar, its wood polish smoothed by decades of reverent hands. Even samurai who spend their days drilling or serving at court pause here each evening. You kneel, straighten your back, and clap twice softly, summoning the attention of whatever spirits might be nearby. The flicker of the candle makes shadows tremble like unseen presences. You breathe out a prayer, not for glory in battle, that would feel outdated in these quiet times, but for steady service. Harmony in your household, maybe even a little more rice in next season's stores. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Samurai were not just warriors, but often deeply tied to Shinto and Buddhist practices. Household shrines were common, and many warriors believed their honor wasn't complete without devotion. They prayed for guidance, for the protection of their family, and sometimes for forgiveness of the lives they had taken in earlier years. A curious, slightly quirky detail. Some samurai carried small protective charms called omamori tucked into their armor, or even sewn into the lining of their clothes. These weren't just lucky trinkets, they were blessed by priests. Imagine a hardened warrior striding into combat with a dainty silk pouch dangling secretly near his chest, embroidered with tiny kanji characters. Deadly steel on the outside, pocket-sized good luck charm on the inside. Historians still argue whether these rituals reflected deep belief or were simply habit, a kind of cultural momentum carried forward because that's just what everyone did. Maybe for some samurai it was genuine spirituality, while for others it was little more than a nightly checkbox like brushing your teeth but with incense. You linger in front of the shrine longer than you intend. The air here feels heavier or maybe just slower. The faint smell of sandalwood hangs in the wood grain, clinging to your sleeve as you bow again before rising. The night has gone hushed, save for the distant splash of water from a garden pond where a carp has disturbed the surface. On the walk back, you pass by a row of small stone lanterns. They're unlit, their hollow eyes staring blankly into the dark. You wonder how many samurai before you walked this same path whispered similar prayers and thought their thoughts equally weighty. The ritual is private, but it connects you to a chain of men long gone, most of whom never made it into the official chronicles. You slip back into your quarters, the tatami mats creaking slightly as you sit down. For a moment, the room feels cavernous in its simplicity. A scroll on the wall depicts Bodhidharma, the legendary founder of Zen Buddhism, his eyes round and glaring, as though scolding you for any slouch in posture. His stern look makes you straighten automatically. You take a moment to light a single stick of incense, the smoke curling upward in thin ribbons. Your eyes follow the spiral until you feel your mind slowing. It's less about gods or ancestors, now more about rhythm. The end of day, the clearing of mind, the soft acceptance that nothing more needs doing tonight. Of course, even in these quiet moments, humor sneaks in. You recall a tale of one samurai who supposedly prayed every night for his horse's teeth not to fall out. That's devotion, certainly, but also desperation. You smirk, wondering what your horse would think if he knew you spent incense money on his dental plan. The smoke fades slowly, leaving only the faint smell clinging to your robe. You extinguish the last ember, blow softly, and let darkness reclaim the room. The night prayer doesn't end with fanfare. It ends with stillness, the candle guttering, the silence stretching, the acceptance that another day has been safely folded into memory. And so, like countless warriors before you, you lie back against your thin futon, comforted less by armor or rank than by the sense that the universe, in its vast quiet, has at least acknowledged your bow. Whether spirits truly heard you or not almost doesn't matter. The ritual itself carries enough weight to lull you toward calm. The night deepens and the estate settles into near silence, broken only by the creak of bamboo fences and the occasional bark of a distant dog. Inside your quarters, the futon lies unrolled across the tatami mats, a modest rectangle of cotton padding that hardly looks like comfort compared to a modern mattress. But after a long day of training, service, and ceremony, your body greets it like a familiar friend. You slide beneath the thin quilt. The air is cool, though not cold, and your cheek presses against a pillow filled with buckwheat husks. It crunches faintly with every shift of your head. This is no feather-stuffed luxury, it's practical, adjustable, and oddly grounding, the way a sandbag might calm a restless horse. You realize, as you wiggle for that just right angle, that some samurai probably found themselves whispering the same small complaint every night. Maybe tomorrow, I'll finally trade this thing in. Here's a mainstream fact. Sleep for the samurai wasn't the endless luxury you might expect from their elevated class. Most samurai kept fairly regimented hours, often rising with the sun and retiring not long after evening meals. Their futons were stored away during the day to free up space in the room, reminding you that their living quarters were multi-purpose, not private havens of comfort. And here's the quirky tidbit. Some samurai supposedly practiced sleeping while sitting upright, believing it kept the body disciplined and ready for sudden alarms. Imagine trying that. One wrong nod and you'd end up face first in your rice bowl? Still, there's a charm to the image stoic warriors, dreaming half-dreams with spines stiff as bamboo rods. Historians still argue whether samurai truly slept lightly, ever ready for attack, or if most nights passed in the same deep, snore-filled slumber as farmers and merchants across Japan. Romanticized accounts say warriors always kept one hand on their sword even in dreams. Skeptics, however, point out the obvious: a man with 2 hours of sword drills. An afternoon of horseback riding and a belly full of rice wine probably wasn't leaping up at the creak of every mouse. The night around you grows softer, cushioned by sound. In the distance, wind brushes across pine trees. A shutter rattles gently before resettling. You close your eyes and imagine the watchman pacing the estate perimeter, his sandals scuffing gravel, ensuring your rest remains undisturbed. The faint smell of incense lingers on your sleeve from your earlier prayers, carrying with it the memory of flame and ritual. As your breathing slows, you think of stories whispered among retainers like the samurai who swore he could dream of future duels, predicting how his enemies would move before blades were ever crossed. Or another who, after a particularly long fast, dreamt of dumplings so vividly he woke up chewing his pillow stuffing. Sleep doesn't spare warriors from absurdity. You shift again, feeling the futon's thinness press against your shoulder. It reminds you how little separates luxury from austerity. Even men with armor polished to brilliance lay down in rooms no bigger than a modest shed, with bedding so basic you'd hesitate to call it a bed today. Yet in that simplicity, there's also an ease. Nothing clutters the space. Nothing distracts you from the steady fate of consciousness. The moonlight sneaks through a crack in the shoshi screen, casting a faint square of silver across the tatami. You watch it blur as your eyelids droop, the shapes softening into formless patches. The day's clamor has finally left your body, and just before you drift off, one last sleepy thought tiptoes through your mind. At least, tonight, no one is summoning you at midnight to put on armor, saddle a horse, and charge off into chaos. War may one day call again, but tonight is yours and you're going to savor the stillness. Dawn creeps in quietly, long before you're ready to abandon the warmth of your futon. The shoshi screens glow faintly as the first light slips through, turning the pale paper walls into a muted lantern. Somewhere beyond the garden, a rooster calls. You groan softly, in your head at least, because even samurai are not immune to the grudge of early mornings. You rise, brushing off stray husks from your pillow, and fold your bedding with practiced precision. It vanishes into the storage chest along the wall, erasing the evidence of sleep and restoring the room to its blank, versatile state. The space can now be a study, a tea room, or if called for, an armory. That's the beauty of tatami rooms, one environment endlessly shifting like an obedient stagehand. Your first duty is personal hygiene, and yes, samurai did care about it. You rinse your face with cold water from a wooden basin, the shock snapping you fully awake. Tooth powder made from charcoal or salt scours your teeth. It's not exactly minty fresh, but it beats morning breath strong enough to scare off a horse. A small comb straightens your top knot, pulling stray hairs into the neat knot that declares, yes, I'm respectable enough to be seen in public. Here's a mainstream fact. Mornings often began with prayer. Samurai who followed Zen might kneel before a small altar, burning incense and bowing silently. Others might whisper ancestral names, asking for strength and guidance. Faith and discipline were woven into the first breaths of the day, a reminder that their lives weren't just their own, but part of a longer chain of loyalty. A quirky tidbit? Some records mention samurai testing their swords on rolled tatami mats or bundles of bamboo before breakfast. Think of it as the medieval Japanese version of swinging a golf club before heading to the office. Except, of course, your practice might leave a tatami roll sliced neatly in two. Historians still argue whether mornings were more about martial drills or household responsibilities. Some accounts describe hours of sparring at dawn. Others hint that samurai often supervised estate management, checking tenant fields, recording rice yields, or settling disputes among farmers. In truth, both could be true. Not every warrior leapt into swordplay before tea. Sometimes the day began with ink and ledgers, not sweat and bruises. Your breakfast arrives, a bowl of steaming rice, miso soup, maybe a grilled fish if you're lucky, and pickled vegetables sharp enough to jolt you awake. The rice sticks lightly to your fingers, the soup's salty warmth steadies your stomach, and you wonder how many mornings have started exactly this way across centuries. Comfort doesn't need extravagance, it just needs repetition. With the meal finished, the day stretches out in familiar routines, training, overseeing, practicing calligraphy, attending ceremonies. Each act feels ordinary, yet together they build the quiet foundation of a life between wars. And perhaps that's the greatest secret of samurai existence. Not the clashing swords, but the spaces in between those long, ordinary days that historians so often skip over. You adjust your hakama, sling your sword at your side, and step into the courtyard. The sunlight is brighter now, catching the polished guard of your blade. Servants hurry past, a dog dozes on the veranda, and beyond the walls, the hum of village life is already in motion. Another day has begun, and though it looks simple, every detail carries weight. Because being samurai wasn't about constant fighting. It was about carrying yourself as if the world might need you at any moment. And so the daily cycle turns. Wake, eat, pray, work, train, rest, sleep repeated endlessly until fate calls otherwise. The rhythm itself becomes its own kind of battle. A fight against idleness, indulgence, and forgetting who you are. And now, as the last words of this story fade, you can let go of the sharp edges and steady rituals of a samurai's day. The futon is folded, the tatami room swept clean, and yet for you, the evening isn't about rising to duty, it's about drifting into rest. Let your body loosen, like the knot of a top knot gently undone at night. Feel the weight of the day slide from your shoulders, as though armor has been carefully lifted and set aside. In its place, there is only the quiet rhythm of your breath, steady and soft. The flicker of lamps fades, the incense smoke thins, and the courtyard beyond grows still. Even the watchman has settled into his pacing stride, so predictable that it almost lulls you on its own. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind reassures you that you are safe, that the night is kind, that nothing urgent waits for you beyond sleep. You may imagine, if you like, the pale wash of moonlight across tatami mats, stretching long shadows that soften with each blink. Or picture a small garden pond where koi stir lazily, their movements barely rippling the surface as stars shimmer above. Allow those images to blur, to dissolve, to drift away like ink spreading across rice paper. The samurai may wake at dawn for another round of duties, but you, tonight, are free. Free to sink, to rest, to float. So breathe deeply, close your eyes. Let the day dissolve. End of script. Sweet dreams.